Brought to you by Moonbeam Multimedia.
This is 16 to 1, a podcast about education, teaching, and learning.
Hello there.
Hey.
I have no caffeine.
Uh-oh.
I just noticed.
I was about to tell you that you seem so much more energetic than the last time that we talked.
I just sat here and looked and I have nothing.
Yeah, do you need something? Should we
Abnormal.
stop?
No, let's figure this out. Let's see what it's like.
Let's just work through it.
I'm awake.
Uh-huh.
It's been great.
Okay.
It's false fall.
It's toasted marshmallow season.
It is toasted marshmallow season, and
You're in the throes of prepping for homecoming, high school homecoming. Tis the season.
it is.
What's the most difficult part of homecoming for you this year?
The students last spring chose Pirates of the Caribbean as the theme,
Okay.
which in April was really funny. September is not so funny.
Okay, so the rubber is hitting the road on the Pirates, and now you've got to make it.
And, I have big news for the pod. I'm quitting my job. I'm opening a balloon arch company.
Oh.
Those things are expensive.
But you hate balloons.
It's worth it.
Okay. So,
Anyways,
moving on.
I feel like you didn't give that any sort of thought.
I'm completely disengaging.
Like you absolutely were like, that's nice, Katie.
We're going to just leave that unaddressed. We have a new format. We're shortening our episodes, and we're doing now every other episode is going to be headlines and researched topics.
So this is
this is a topic.
a research.
Yeah, some research this week. And we're going to provide a lot of interesting resources on student well-being and mental health in schools and stuff like that. But before we get to that, I do want to remind you, go ahead and sign up for our 16 to 1 podcast email newsletter. You'll get the latest updates, episode announcements, resources, workshop offerings from Moonbeam Multimedia. That's us coming at you soon.
So there's a 2021 advisory by the U.S. Surgeon General's office. And this was called Protecting Youth Mental Health. And they highlighted significant challenges and trends affecting the mental health of young individuals. Before COVID, there was a noticeable increase in mental health issues among youth, including major depressive episodes and suicidal thoughts. The pandemic exacerbated these issues through prolonged social isolation and school closures, which of course led to heightened levels of anxiety and depression for some.
Yeah.
I do think it's refreshing to know that this was before COVID as well, because I feel like COVID has been sort of a marker for these things. And I'm happy that it gave us a chance to realize the importance of it, but it was happening before, too.
Yeah, a couple of the things that I was reading to research for this episode, they were suggesting that actually that has been one of the positive effects of COVID having happened, is that now people are noting that COVID has made it more commonplace to discuss mental health initiatives and outcomes and concerns, whereas before it was even more of an uphill battle to get people to pay attention to those things.
For sure.
We don't have the option to ignore this anymore. So more
from that advisory, they noted the potential negative effects of increased screen time and social media use on youth's mental health. And that, of course, is linked then to depression and anxiety. The advisory also called for expanding access to mental health services, which includes like telehealth opportunities, and also strengthening mental health workforces in schools.
And also just strengthening school staff, the size of school staff in general, not just mental health.
Right.
As it turns
just
out.
More adults, more qualified.
Teachers means more individualized attention,
more support,
which help mental health outcomes.
So maybe smaller class sizes might also support this type of...
They might.
Okay. So the advisory also stressed the importance of reducing the stigma associated with seeking mental health care and support. And they cited research showing that a significant portion of youth globally are experiencing elevated depressive symptoms, with early estimates indicating over 6,600 suicides among individuals ages 10 to 24 in 2020.
Yeah. I also found some statistics on colleges and universities. It's an organization called the American College Health Association. They conduct a well-being assessment. Covers 14 dimensions of wellness recognized by experts as being important to student well-being in higher ed. And we'll link to the assessment and the results from 2023. It was a pilot survey. I think it was 6 campuses and like 5,600 respondents in college communities. It also included parent and guardian feedback, it looks like, from some of the results. There were some totally unsurprising things in this report, to me anyway. Things like trans and queer students rating relatively low to their peers, very low on happiness and high on anxiety and loneliness scores. Varsity athletes seem to be untroubled as a subpopulation, which I thought was quite interesting.
That just does not compute in my head.
They were highest on happiness, lowest on anxiety. That is so interesting.
So opposite of my experience of varsity athletes.
All of the mental health categories, they scored highest against other subpopulations.
I just am thinking of all of the groups that are working to help support athletes in colleges because of abnormally high suicidal rates among them. Like we're talking about like a Stanford soccer player in the past, like I can think of like 4 or 5 examples just in the last couple of years.
Yeah, no, I didn't mean to be saying that they're doing great.
No,
I'm saying just
I know.
relative. It's only relative to peers that I'm talking about.
Sure.
So I guess I
think that's an interesting point then.
Yeah. To me, it just highlights that there is something to be said for the tight-knit community.
And I guess maybe that physical activity could be good for you.
Yeah.
That's upsetting.
And then here was the main takeaway for me was that about 40% of students reported some form of psychological or mental health conditions, such as anxiety, depression, those kinds of things.
So these are the students that are aware of it, which I think is fascinating as well. So again, that's a whole nother group.
Back to the anxious generation, which we have talked about, I think, at least 3 times on the pod. Minimum. I don't know. I talk about it a lot.
That's probably a low estimate.
Well, it was one of my favorite reads from last year. And Jonathan Haidt is definitely working in this space of student well-being. So I do want to just highlight that resource again and say that it does a really deep dive suggesting a strong correlation between excessive social media use and rising figures in anxiety, depression, loneliness among students. Difficulty disconnecting. Students often express that they feel like they can't get away from their devices, much like many adults I know feel this way, myself included. I think I mentioned this before, but that book did change my mind.
It really radicalized you.
School cell phone bans. Well, cell phone use in schools when we were in school does not mean the same thing that it now means, because cell phones had just become a thing and social media was at the very beginning. Right when we were going through our most vulnerable period of growth and learning. And we had phones, but they weren't the phones that are now destroying people's mental health. Let's just say.
No.
So that's why I changed I was like, oh,
that's a different
when
thing.
You go and look at the data, when you go and look at the increase in rates of anxiety and depression and suicide and all of these things, and you look at when it happened, it's hard to avoid the consequences of that data, I think.
Sure.
So anyway, it did. It made me change my mind about it. So, okay. Well, let's talk about some of the other factors that are driving student mental health crises now. You see a lot of them in your day-to-day.
So academic pressure, obviously, this could be a really intense focus on a high-stakes test. Trying to get into college or even trying to get into some other type of work program that can sometimes be pretty limited and difficult to be admitted into. You see things like trying to get those top grades, right? And how that stress can hit students. Other groups are like those that are economically unstable, right? So if you're experiencing financial instability or food insecurity or experiencing homelessness, someone is in prison or someone is here and you're with an aunt or, whatever. And these are the types of students, especially, that a lot of them have to work to support their families, or they are the babysitter, or they are the driver. Those are sometimes the students that education isn't a priority.
We spent a lot of time talking about that in our Maslow's hierarchy episode. It's like we have to meet basic needs before learning can happen. Mental health, it's not some icing on top that we can kind of ignore. It's a necessary precondition for learning.
Yeah. There's like a poem. I'll try to find it somewhere to share in the show notes, but it's like from the perspective of a young kid and like how hard it was for them to get to school that day. And then they get to school after fighting like all of these battles just to get there. And it's like the teacher yells at them for not having a pencil.
Mm-hmm.
All that you went through to get here for the day. The teacher doesn't know that. The teacher just sees you unprepared. But those are the things that run in the back of my head a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so another subset of these issues, political environmental anxieties. Our people, our students, us, maybe have fear surrounding climate change and political polarization and the global crises. And my students especially will make jokes like, don't worry, the earth won't outlive me. And I can tell that it's a little bit jokey and it's a little bit real for them sometimes.
I mean, I don't know how we expect teenagers to be okay with these impending crises when, like, we are not okay. The adults in the room are not okay with the impending crises either.
Yeah, like I'm not okay with turning on the news.
What kind of work do we need to be doing? What kind of goals do we need to be setting for what I think of as a relatively uncertain future?
Like, do I keep paying my taxes? Is this gonna?
No, you definitely I'm kidding. Your taxes.
I'm kidding. I've always paid my taxes. Yeah, right. I'm such a rule follower. I would never. The earth could be crumbling, and I'd be trying to find the IRS's phone number. And like, how many times have we said in the last 5 years, man, I would just love a precedented time.
A precedented time. Please give me one.
Okay, in the last couple here. Disrupted sleep patterns.
Oh, yeah.
I could never imagine why those might be disrupted based on everything I've listed so far.
There's also an ongoing battle over school start times being fought in a lot of places. There are competing studies about the ideal time when certain subpopulations of students should be awake to do their best learning. And like, should that really be at like 7 a.m, or should we have a later start?
Yeah. I'm a 7:15 to 2:30, but I love my schedule, so I'm not going to nag on it too much here. Okay, one last thing.
Yes.
Just isolation due to the pandemic. So we know that the remote learning and for some that social isolation during COVID contributed to a sharp rise in feelings of loneliness and anxiety. And the other thing that I wanted to mention about this is that I think it was already happening before COVID, but especially since COVID. I see kids participating in fewer and fewer things at the high school. I see kids that used to be maybe 3 sport athletes focus on one and things like that.
Do you think any of that is due to each individual sport becoming more and more demanding of their like whole calendar year?
100%.
I felt like I saw that trend when I was in school, even where I had a bunch of peers who were multi-sport athletes, but they were starting to feel increasing pressure to like
focus in.
Only do volleyball or only do softball.
Well, I was a assistant varsity softball coach and worked with that team for a few years. And I saw a lot of that in that time. Not only that our athletes felt like they had to focus on softball to go wherever division for college, but also from other teams, other sports within our high school saying they had to play spring ball if they wanted to play volleyball. And so that meant we had to deal with, our pitcher playing 12, 13 hours on Sunday of volleyball to come in on Monday and throw 90 some pitches or something.
Yeah, I think that's too much.
I think it's too much. And I think that I do not think athletes are made better by focusing in on just one thing.
Yeah.
That also could build some pretty intense competition and things like that. And I think competition can be healthy, but in the way that teenage athletes are treated, it isn't.
Maybe not so much in certain contexts.
And I really just truly believe that some of the healthiest athletes I've ever coached and played with and know myself personally were multi-sport athletes. And they did all kinds of things. They weren't just athletes. They were all types of people. And I think that that's important.
More holistic.
And I actually feel like that's probably what helped me was that I did have so many groups of people that I was around and I did so many different types of activities.
Yeah.
And that kept me really well grounded. And it gave me people in my corner everywhere. I had all types of people that I could, go to.
I'm going to have to track it down, but I found a chart during this research that was like basically cataloging how many in-person social activities teenagers did per week and how it just like started plummeting. And it's around the same, it's like the anxious generation window. It's like the social media screen-based childhood window. Young people are doing less being together and they're just not doing it as much. They're really not.
And I mean, we sound like the olds right now, but I guess we kind of are in these ways.
We do, but I think that people maybe aren't quite as aware of this phenomenon. We're not like ancient, but we've been around long enough that our ideas about what social media is have gone through an evolution, because social media has changed so much from what it was when we first started using it even. Yeah. So anyway, there's a lot going on, but I think that your observations do match up with data suggesting that kids just aren't participating in these kinds of things.
Yeah. And
to the extent they were previously.
I think actually what helped me deal with my anxiety and depression for so long was that I was so busy and involved, and I was active and things like that.
Exercising and doing all those things.
Yeah, like I was always moving, which I now realize was good for me, and that I am better if I, those types of things. So what we thought might be useful was to share some really great groups, nonprofits, organizations that help communities, educators, teachers, people, humans, teenagers, whatever, get some help if they need it.
Yes. The first one is an organization called HundreED with a capital ED. This organization launched a Wellbeing in Schools project, which is a global initiative to identify and promote impactful educational innovations that enhance student well-being. And they've published a collection of innovations. They do it every year, I think. They highlight impactful, sustainable, and scalable innovations in schools. They have a whole bunch of different categories, but I pulled out the ones for the well-being category for this year's innovations. And I just picked out 3 that sounded kind of interesting. The first was the Happy Schools Initiative. It's a program developed by a Kenyan nonprofit called Cheza that uses dance as a tool to improve mental health and overall well-being in schools. And again, it's focused on underserved communities in Kenya, but they're kind of trying to branch out. Another one was called Mario Education, all caps. I hadn't heard of this one before, but it's a U.S.-based program designed to strengthen critical student-teacher relationships through one-on-one learning conversations. Kind of gives this structure of check-ins and personalized learning plans, trying to make sure that all students have emotional and academic support. They're now working with more than 40,000 students in 30 countries. And then one from the UK, it's called Quality Interactions and Creativity. It's a community interests company. They're focused on supporting vulnerable and at-risk youth through a blend of arts, coaching, and emotional and cognitive learning. There's this whole big catalog of all of these different initiatives and programs. You can read how they select them, but they try to basically find the ones that they think can be replicated and used by educators in other contexts.
That's cool. There's one called Active Minds, which is a nonprofit dedicated to raising mental health awareness among college students. And so they create support networks on campuses across the country. They also provide opportunities for teachers, professors, local community members to use their programs for not only professional development, but also in their communities. And they had tons of really nice resources on their website. And some of their work is also to help make sure that they're supporting policy changes and to build stronger communities in doing so.
Cool.
What else you got?
The Let Grow Project, co-founded by Jonathan Haidt of the Anxious Generation authorship. This focuses on fostering independence in children. This ends up being one of the major themes of that book, that we're restricting independence of young people in a way that is overly aggressive. So the Let Grow Project focuses on fostering independence in children, counteracting over-parenting, and giving kids space to build resilience, support for parents and other people who are raising these kids to allow more freedom, correlating mental health to independence and self-efficacy and things like that. And then you've got a few more here, yeah?
Yeah. Well, the first one is called To Write Love on Her Arms. My students call it TWLOA. They are a nonprofit dedicated to presenting hope and finding help for people struggling with depression, addiction, self-injury, suicide. They partner up with a lot of athletes and stuff like that. They've made some pretty famous campaigns. That's a group that I know my students have used. And then the last 2 are more kind of geared towards LGBTQ plus people. So they're the Trevor Project and the Matthew Shepard Foundation. The Trevor Project specializes in crisis intervention and suicide prevention for LGBTQ plus people. They offer resources like a lifeline in the Trevor space for peer support. And then the other one I mentioned was the Matthew Shepard Foundation. He was a young man killed in Casper, Wyoming in, I think, 1998. His family developed this foundation to not only remember him, but to also provide support and empowering people in communities to especially help people that are looked at as others. Mm-hmm. So those are a few of the ones I've seen my students personally partner up with or use. You're always like walking the line, right? Of like trying to prepare students for the world, what's next, this class, but also trying to love them as people. I know that in my 12 years so far that has been something I've struggled back and forth with. Am I more useful to them if I'm holding them to like this higher standard, or am I more useful to them if I'm willing to bend? Mm-hmm. And that's a hard thing to walk.
For sure.
And
you don't want to be like the teacher that everybody says, oh, that teacher was easy. Like,
right.
You don't want to cope with this reality by becoming that. That's
right.
The issue.
And so like, I've had students say both things about me, mm-hmm. that I was way too strict and that I was way too easy. And probably for both of those students, that was their experience of me. And I think that that's probably reasonable too. Like I think about all the teachers I ever thought were tough, and they probably had both. I think it's okay. But it's definitely something that I grapple with as far as like, my job is still this. So I want to achieve these things and I want them to accomplish these things, but at what cost? Mm-hmm. And that's where it falls back for me. Do I need to be tough or do I need to love them?
So it sounds like what you're describing is basically at a high level trauma-informed teaching.
Yeah.
You're saying like, hey, I understand certain things about these realities. I need to be open to the possibility that I'm meeting students at a variety of different places
for sure.
With regard to their own mental health.
Yep. And this is something, trauma-informed teaching is something that's come up a lot since I've been in school. Yeah. Since I've been working.
Still in
the schools. Yeah. I just had my, 29 first days I've had now. I think something like that. This has been a popular PD thing to kind of come through recently as far as learning about trauma-informed teaching, which I think is great. But I will say that what I've done so far has made me much more patient and willing as a teacher to be flexible, which was something that I was taught in teacher school to not be.
You were taught in teacher school to be inflexible?
I don't know if I'd say I was taught to be inflexible, but I was taught that expectations, firmness, rigid. We were told that like that was how you handle a classroom.
Oh,
I do think there's a line for students to know how far they can push me.
Yeah, I understand. That's not an easy thing.
You know, the more that I learn about my students, that's just completely shifted everything I do.
Well, you can also tell from conversations we've had, or even on this pod, with you, when you look at the research, grade inflation research, like clearly the strict approach that teaching schools or, education programs are trying to impart, that's not working. Like grade inflation has been rising for quite some time and it's not helping.
What can I do in their day to make it better? These, I think, are the questions that trauma-informed teaching wants you to do. At what level can I meet them? How can I make them feel seen or heard? How can I be aware of what's going on at home, but still like hold them accountable? It's all of those types of questions. And it's very difficult.
Yeah. I think this is a difficult reality for communities and other like parents and other stakeholders like that who obviously care about the outcome of like a public education system, but who aren't necessarily integrally involved in it. I think it's hard for those people to grapple with the reality that part of your job is to address the fact that not everybody comes to the project of learning with the same energy to do it, just for whatever reason.
And some people only show up because they have to.
It's not optional in that case to figure out how to be kind and understanding towards students. It's not a nice to have. That's what I was saying earlier. It's not like an additional, it's not a bonus thing to get kids engaged in learning. And getting kids engaged in learning can look weird or non-traditional or lenient or whatever it may be. But we need to adjust our expectations about what engaging people in learning looks like. We have a different reality that has to be met with different teaching practices.
We do. I have become more lenient and I have slowed down and I have done these things because it's what's good and right for me and my students. Allison, who's been on the pod with us a couple times, she does like mental health days and they'll like color and watch like peaceful YouTube videos, like those aquarium videos. And it's usually not like a whole day necessarily. Maybe it's a day after a test. Maybe it's a catch-up day, whatever.
It's like
and so
a slow media moment.
A little slow.
It does feel an awful lot like we are not inviting children to have the lives of children very often in the typical public school setting. Yeah. We are preparing young people to become cogs in the American workplace, and they obviously need to know how to do that to support themselves and be independent. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing that we're preparing them to do that. However, we need to also honor childhood. Doing that's a different those thing. Are the moments that create curiosity and fun and interest in learning and a sense of community, which is obviously very important to mental health outcomes. Like peer support networks are important to have. One
of the funniest things that came from that, for like the rest of the year, kids would bring me coloring sheets that they'd done. We hung them in my room. Kids would be like, you didn't hang mine up. Oh, you hung up so-and-so's. It was just so funny, but it was like the simplest thing.
Well, it's fun for them because they get to shape their physical environment with something goofy, but still like meaningful. It creates community buy-in, I think.
It does. So I've worked, especially seeing Allison do it, and I feel like when you're a young teacher, you're always trying so hard for the output and for the data, for the whatever. Mm-hmm. And Allison has actually kind of helped me shape that a little bit because, you know, I'm a state tested teacher. So I always have that over my head. Seeing her do those types of things has actually been really good for me because it's helped me kind of let loose a little bit. And that's something I'm actually trying to do more of this year. My school's always like, we teach bell to bell, all of this. And it's like, okay, we do, but it looks like a lot of things.
But also,
teaching is a lot of
human
things.
Beings.
Yeah. Okay. And so I've got to give myself some grace, and these are the types of things that help teachers too.
Does your own experience of being a teenager have anything to do with why you are now feeling that this is important to provide to students? Like, did you have mental health supports in high school growing up?
Or? Not that I had it, but I didn't know I did. Does that make sense? It was the activities, it was the people, it was my adults in my life. It was the teachers who played euchre with us sometimes when we probably shouldn't have. But I didn't know that that's actually what I was dealing with.
This is like kind of like intangibles.
Yeah. Like I didn't know when I was that young actually how bad my anxiety was. I thought I just had an upset tummy and I was like nervous all the time.
Yeah. I didn't know either. I had terrible mental health in high school and I did not know it because I just thought a lot of my peers felt the same way that I did. Maybe it is normal in the sense that a lot of people do it, but it's not necessarily something that we should be requiring teenagers to put themselves through.
So it wasn't the kind of intentional that I'm talking about, that we're talking about now, but it did happen for me. I certainly wish I would have known better when I was younger, just for my own health, right? To know what I was dealing with, to understand the relationship of like hormones and all of those things, you know? So, like those are still things I'm learning about.
Oh yeah, I'd get like hormonal migraines once a month and like lose a week of good studying and just think that I was a terrible student that week. I'd just be like, well, I guess I'm just bad at thinking. Better try again next week and like pick up the slack.
Or to go through bouts of like sleeplessness. And I have really incredible parents who are always at every single event, did every single thing. They would do anything for me. Mm-hmm. But I think part of their generation was also not understanding it.
I agree. They did not have the language or the tools in the toolbox to identify this stuff for what it was.
Like I don't think it's their fault that was kind of how their world was too. Mm-hmm. But you know, when I got diagnosed, my mom was like, "Oh well, of course," and I was like, "Hey, you should have told me. Why was I the last to know?"
Yeah, but I've had conversations like that too, where I'm like, "Hey, I have panic attacks now," and they're like, "What do you mean? You've always had that?" And I'm like, "Excuse me."
But like as a kid, you don't know like what you're living are these things. What my mom and my dad were actually doing with me was like teaching me healthy coping strategies. And I just didn't know that that's what I was doing.
Well, how do you, as an educator, deal with parents or raisins who either aren't supportive,
it's so hard.
who are like actively like, that's BS, I'm not helping my kid with that? There are those ones who are hostile to the idea of mental health support. There is group 2 who is just unknowing and kind of indifferent to it because they don't really understand the problem. Or there's group 3 who kind of embrace the importance of mental health outcomes and stuff like that.
It's really hard. you're met with a lot of like, well, they just gotta toughen up or they just gotta whatever. There have been some parents that I've been like, look, I was a high enough achieving student. I seemingly have it all, and yet I still need help. Like, I happily would tell my students that I'm medicated and that I'm always trying to make myself better and, do these types of things. And so it's hard to share that stuff sometimes.
Mm-hmm. But it's important because you're actively destigmatizing conversations around mental health.
And so that's why I do it. And it's gone both ways with parents. Some parents are like, well, maybe you shouldn't be teaching. And then some parents are like, oh. And you can see that it's clicking. People who see these kids all the time and are struggling themselves and are like finding a way that can help my students. Because I want them to see me working through it, even when I'm struggling. But the same thing for their parents, too.
Mm-hmm.
I think the more that we share those things, it only gets easier.
It's empowering to know that there is a reason why you're struggling.
Yeah.
If you understand what's happening to you, you can understand how to manage the symptoms of what's happening to you better. You can prepare. Yeah. You can be proactive for your own health.
And I have no problem being like, whoa, my brain is not here today, folks. And my kids will laugh it off. And there is humor to it. Sometimes my brain isn't where I really need it to be. And the humanity of it is like what's good.
I think all of my favorite teachers, a common trend among them is that they could admit that they had off days. Or just be like, yeah, things are weird right now. And like
one of my best friends at school, a coworker, she's going through some stuff with a illness in her family. And my students and our students have seen us come together. It's been great to be in the community because we know we have each other. And I think it's good for the kids to see us struggle or thrive or show up because that's part of it.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard for teachers a lot of times, like, let that guard down. But it's always better for them to see us than to see some facade. Even though we changed the format a little bit, we're still keeping our fill in the blanks, and we're still keeping our what we learned.
We are.
So, fill in the blank.
Yes.
Last episode's question. Founded in January of 2001, Wikipedia changed the way that people learned and searched for information online. Today, there are roughly 250 million hits on Wikipedia pages daily. Who were the two founders of Wikipedia? They were Larry Sanger and Jimmy Wales. What you got?
This week's question. We've been talking about FAFSA a lot, the free application for federal student aid form, and its rather disastrous rollout for a second year in a row.
12 months, yeah. Okay. 15 months at this point.
So it's about that. Originally called FAF.
FAF.
The financial aid form, unfortunately.
Unfortunately, the FAF.
Was created in the Higher Education Act of what year?
Yeah.
When was the legislation enacted? Yeah. All right, what'd you learn this week?
This is about baseball.
Go figure.
Okay.
You never tell us anything about baseball.
Up. Anyways, for the first time in MLB history, a player has played for both teams in the same game.
Oh.
June 26th of 2024, Danny Jansen caught for the Blue Jays versus the Red Sox, and the game was suspended because of weather. The game resumed August 26th after Danny Jansen had been traded to the Red Sox from the Blue Jays. In that game, he was the catcher.
That's pretty fun.
Yeah. It was very fun to read about the baseball world at this time because they were like, what's the scoring like? Is it a sub? Is it a... Yeah, it was
such a long delay.
Yeah. What you got?
Ooh, I learned about the Uncensored Library.
Okay.
It is a virtual library created within Minecraft, the video game.
Okay.
By the organization Reporters Without Borders.
Okay.
In collaboration with a design studio called Blockworks. It was launched in 2020. It's a digital space designed to bypass censorship in certain countries and give players access to articles and news where press freedom is being restricted.
So they read it in Minecraft?
They're stored in like this giant detailed library within on a Minecraft
server.
Instance. Yeah.
Okay.
So you can read articles from journalists and publications that have been banned or censored in various countries. The countries represented in the library include Egypt, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Vietnam, and Mexico. This is all places where press freedom is under threat. Journalists' work that would otherwise be inaccessible due to government censorship is presented in books within the Minecraft world, allowing people everywhere access to information without fear of surveillance or restriction.
That's so cool. Can I give a couple of book shout-outs before we bounce?
I would love for you to. Yes, please.
Last week, I somehow managed to read finish the 2 best books of the year within a day.
Oh, okay.
God, what a gift books are.
What were they?
I just can't believe it. First one was called Remarkably Bright Creatures by Shelby Van Pelt. And it is about a woman aging and seeing what will become of her life after some loss.
Okay.
And kind of how it correlates to her work in this aquarium. And more specifically, the one octopus that is in the aquarium, who is also at the end of his like natural life. Oh. And so it's like a play back and forth.
Okay. Between
these two. It is brilliant. I laughed, I cried, everything.
Sounds interesting.
Okay, the other one, Chelsea and I actually listened to this together in a car ride, and then we finished it the very next day.
Yes.
Because we could not quit it. It's called The Women by Kristen Hanna. If you know Kristen Hanna, it's probably because you've read The Nightingale. But The Women is a story of one woman in particular, but a slew of others who served as nurses during Vietnam.
Yeah, combat nurses.
All of the struggles that we now know combat veterans have dealt with and continue to struggle with. Kristen Hanna is just a wordsmith.
I have a hole in my knowledge around the Vietnam War and just everything related to that conflict. Mm-hmm. And it was a very interesting commentary on coming home from Vietnam.
Yeah.
In addition to other things, and like the social mess of returning soldiers at the time in a very unpopular war.
We're like a little bit young for that conflict.
I learned a lot about it and just how wrong everything went, and it's
a great book. And now I'm in a lull. I'm afraid I'll never recover from these two.
I read The Secret History this week too.
You did read a Donna Tartt book that I quit.
In like 3 days.
I DNF'd it.
I loved The Goldfinch, and I did not love The Secret History. A bunch of nerds obsessed with classics, and I'm like, I don't need to read a big giant book about this because I already lived
this is my actual life.
I did not live the murder mystery part, to be clear.
Cool. And if you have any books to recommend, please. My Libby account is empty.
Yeah, write into us. hello@16to1.com. We'll see you in 2 weeks for education news headlines.
Goodbye.
Goodbye. Hey listeners, thanks for supporting 16 to 1. We're your co-hosts. I'm Chelsea Adams.
And I'm Katie Day. Find our show notes, archives, and resources, sign up for our newsletter, or get in touch with us via the contact form at 16to1.com, all spelled out.
We are so grateful for our listener support. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing to the show and telling your friends or colleagues about it.
The show is edited and produced by you, Chelsea Adams, and you're also responsible for our show's music.
And you, Katie Day, serve as lead researcher and social media manager.
Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you next show.
It can be rough out there for the balloon archerers.
No.
Archmages.
Balloon artists.
Balloon artists.
That makes me sound like a clown
Archists.
At a sideshow. And I'm just making a dog over and over and over again.